Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much, Deb, for that very generous introduction and telling us a bit about the history behind the project and how it's come about. The project called Belonging, Disbelonging. And it's been a really great pleasure to be in conversation with Alex and Layla also over the last couple of years to develop I guess we didn't really know what was going to be developed, so to evolve together. And so I just wanted to also introduce them a bit more formally / informally, because I don't really like formal introductions, but I do have their bios. I'm going to just borrow from that a bit and talk a bit about where they both come from. They do have a lot of intersecting alignments and interests in their work. Both Alex and Layla really look at intersectional experiences of of being disabled, trans, neurodivergence, and queerness within their practices as well. Specifically, Alex, who's based in the Midlands and in the West Midlands specifically, has been quite prolific and show after show, residency after residency, project after project, and we've been also a bit wow, that's incredible. So they've really shown and exhibited quite widely, including at the States, St. Ives, at the Fierce Festival in Birmingham, at MAC, at Eastside Projects, and at Camden People's Theatre in London. And in general, they think a lot about survival in their work, ways of surviving into the future. She really also looks at adapting her work to see what fits best to talk about what exactly needs to be revealed to the audience, and research and experimentation are at the core of that as well. And so I guess in this forum, you do see films, quite a film, quite a rich, layered, long, almost 2 hours long?
83 minutes.
83 minutes film, sumptuous, really layered, which also a banner and these objects as well. And the film is called Trans-Uranic Elements, and we'll discuss a bit about exactly what's happening with all of that in a bit. Sophia-Layla, who I've known also in Karachi for more than almost 3 years now, so time flies quite quickly. Also comes was formerly a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, and has been practicing art quite really intensely for the last 3 years, and is a multidisciplinary artist. Her work integrates trans and autistic experiences, emotional care, and play within her art practice, and she did this also in the residency that happened in Karachi that we'll talk a bit more about. Layla creates interactive situations that prompt visitors to co-create and co-perform in the exhibition space. And of course, there's a lot of play and experimentation involved within that for not just you, but also the people who are participating with you. And the sculptural work also deploy assemblage and collage that challenge conventions of fixed visual composition. Layla's also been showing quite prolifically and speaking quite a bit about their work, and has shown in Berlin, in Karachi, and now in the UK, and also is a practicing therapist alongside being an artist. So on that note, shall we just jump into this conversation? And I guess for me, it would just be nice to maybe each of you spending a minute to talk a bit about your individual inspirations that has led us to this space that we've seen created, which is a fabulous, immersive, glittery, object-driven, lots happening in that space for those who haven't seen it yet. But also I think a lot of space to still breathe and to be quiet and to just, be gentle and relaxed as well, and to chill. But perhaps it would be nice to talk a bit about where does that come from, the space for you? What has been your research and individual journey towards this as it led you to creating this moment together? Any of you can go first.
Okay. Yeah, because I have a practice that jumps around a lot of different things. I pull from a lot of different sources. One thing that was particularly useful in relation to how you structure the film was there's a film from, I think, the 60s or 70s called The Colour of Pomegranates that's, again, very little dialogue, and it's more driven by the imagery, because at 83 minutes, you need to make something that people can both dip in and out of and make their bus and just go, okay, I can see it for 30 seconds, but also hopefully that they can come back to and sit with and get trapped and go, I can get the next bus, it's fine, I can stay and watch this. So that was a major sort of filmic influence. But then I pull from lots of different sources. There's lots of old low-budget sci-fi bits that fall in. So things like Sapphire and Steel, which is where the title kind of came from, and Star Maidens, which if you've seen it, you've seen it, and if you haven't, you don't need to. But it's part of it's incredibly glam and incredibly bright. But then also it's kind of pulling together lots of different bits from things that I've been sort of looking at for years. So ideas of mapping the trans experience onto the lunar cycle, and that kind of pulls in lots of bits, like with how things are tidal and bodies are fluid and they kind of shift and change, but also things like Space 1999 and those kind of barren landscapes. And then there are some actual sort of proper artistic references, if I've got time, or am I?
You can, I'm sure we can, this is not like, very prescriptive conversation. We can just keep on talking as well. But it can also be like, you guys can also respond to each other. So you can jump in, but also, you can kind of loop back.
But yeah, more on the artistic side, I think the three that have been quite useful, which is Rachel McLean, who does a lot of work with video work and is amazing. And every time I look at their work, I'm like, it's too good, damn it. But equally, that kind of comparativeness isn't helpful. So it's also nice to see their older work and go, okay, they've learned and they've evolved, and I can too. And then Emma Franklin, who's a trans theatre maker in Brighton, sort of mainly. They were really useful in my own sort of trans journey and really helpful in discovering kind of where I am with things. And then there's a playwright called Luke Skillback, who was incredibly useful in kind of teaching me structure and format and how theatre and plays kind of work. And although there's no dialogue in my films, it's still kind of mapped on, and there is that level of, right, structurally this kind of has to happen and this has to happen, which I think has kind of improved the work. And I'll shush now.
No, that's okay. I want to talk more about these inspirations as well, like in continuing kind of conversations, and especially borrowing from trans and kind of other artists and histories. But Layla, do you just want to jump in here and talk a bit about where you're coming from? And I also just want to say, we'll talk about this as well, but behind us we're on like a bit of a loop. And at the moment the loop is showing some glimpses of the residency kind of results, let's say, that were shown in Karachi at the Indus Valley School Gallery almost about a year ago as well. So, and you can see those references kind of feeding into the final kind of exhibition and project today. So just wanted to kind of also like just know that that's happening, because I know that will come into your work as well. Yes.
So for me, it has been a bit of an unconventional journey coming to the world of art. And I, as many people who were taught in school to sort of make things with our hands and be very precise, was very discouraged initially to enter the art world. But that sort of changed a few years ago when Aziz, amongst other people, sort of encouraged me to sort of take it up a little bit. In terms of my inspirations, it comes from a lot of traditional healing practices, a lot of indigenous healing practices in Pakistan, as well as my therapy training. So when I trained as a therapist, it was I think 7 years ago that I qualified, a lot of the work that therapists are taught traditionally in terms of how to work one-on-one with clients felt a little inadequate to me in terms of healing journeys and what we are trained to say and not say, and the limits within what therapeutic practice involves. For me, it was a lot more about why are there these arbitrary limits in terms of play, in terms of emotional disclosure that are placed in the therapeutic practice. And that led me to a hunger towards using art as a vehicle for other people's healing. And in addition to that, there was, of course, care was an important element in terms of how that came about. I was also, over time, very, very conscious of how through so social justice dialogue, we have a lot of discussions around power and privilege and how that operates within a therapeutic space, within an art space. So a lot of those discussions that originated from, people like, when we talk about intersectionality, which we'll come to, I guess, and the role of the therapist as either having privilege over or having intersections in which they might potentially be marginalized within the therapeutic space which they're offering care, how that sort of opened the dialogue in terms of very interesting outlooks where perhaps either the therapist is being told things that they're not ready to talk about, there's a little bit of disconnect within the space, or the client is being told things they don't want to talk about, there's a little bit of disconnect in that space, and how that sort of, how power dynamics sort of influence that. So that was a really big inspiration. As far as the formal art practice is concerned, situation art is a big part of what I do, and I have sort of, there's a long tradition of people who traditionally might or might not be considered artists, sort of doing things like flash mobs or doing these ad hoc performances which have been popularized through YouTube, where they would turn up and they would sort of do street theater and then disappear. So that was really, really interesting to me. So for me, a lot of my work is not telling people that I'm performing and just turning up and doing things that might surprise them or challenge them in certain ways, as a way to sort of to challenge people's expectations in terms of what an art space actually involves. And one very important element of that is how respectability comes up in a space, and through how traditional concepts of transness in Pakistan, which are usually associated with either begging or sex work, how those can be subverted in a more quote-unquote respectable space. And the expectations that I would bring a very different angle, or I would be one of the good ones, quote-unquote, and not exactly following that trope, but actually bringing what people associate with less respectability within a gallery space, but doing it in a way that it sort of makes it more respectable, which really challenges people a little bit. So it is a lot of sort of traditional trans practices, traditional care practices, and those kind of things that I bring to my work.
I know we've prepared a list of points for discussion, but because both of you are talking about traditional trans practices and care practices and kind of borrowing from references, I'm just going to kind of go into one of the points that we have discussed, but bring it in a bit earlier, which was that you specifically, and we've talked about this, that that queer, Alex, you were talking a lot about queer erasure within history and collections, and I know that with the new Art Gallery Walsall, you've had a bit of a kind of longer term journey as well for the last few years, where you are still, I think, part of the community, or were part of the community collection panel that kind of, and the collection panel has been kind of looking at different themes, but within your kind of focus with your group, you were kind of thinking of kind of representation of queerness within the collection and kind of what gets erased, and the project kind of led to this kind of 1 year display or rethinking of the collections called Here and Queer, and through that you have been thinking about also within your own art practice, thinking about erasure and ways in ways in which this work does not get translated or gets translated, and how to kind of showcase it or bring it. So I guess thinking of the fact that you're both really touching upon specific historical and kind of pop culture and popular references as well in your work, it would be really nice to talk a bit about this kind of erasure, but also the way that your work is trying to do that repair work to kind of overcome that erasure.
Yeah, I mean, with Here and Queer, Julie Brown is the collections manager, and they organised it, and John Slay was the sort of attached academic who was really amazing. It was the first time I kind of had the chance to consider, museums do tend to, unless there's a smoking gun, they tend to remove it. And then through the conversations that came up, actually even when there is a smoking gun, they still tend to remove queer labelling from the work, because it can be seen to be more difficult to sell to collectors. And so that was the first time I was sort of encountering that and realising that if I'm making my work, and if I'm very, very clear about the fact that I am trans and that I am queer and I am disabled and neurodiverse, it makes it very, very, very difficult to remove that from the work. So hopefully, this is assuming it gets seen in 100 years or whatever, but if it does, or if it informs things, I don't think there's a way that you can remove my identity from the work. So hopefully, when you get people growing up, there is that embedded history in a way that is not as removable as it has been. The film that I've done, there's literally one small section where I talk, which I felt was important, so there was a kind of personal investment and connection. And I'm talking about section 28 and the fact that while I was growing up, there was no queer representation. So it became incredibly difficult to survive and to find myself, but equally, I'm still here and I'm still just as queer, so section 28 did not work.
Layla, you wanna jump in?
Refresh my memory. I've just.
Oh, it's just talking about queer erasure and history within arts and collections, but also borrowing from specific references and honoring specific histories. And I guess you're also talking about Section 28, but of course also in Pakistan we have legal frameworks or lack thereof also as well around trans and kind of queer rights that I know you are thinking about or referring to in your work.
Yeah, I think sort of queer history, of course, is much less overt in sort of South Asian tradition. There's a lot more fluidity and opacity than there would be in the West, and much less focus on individual identity. So it's interesting because in many ways what the moral panic that is happening right now is imposing that identitarian lens that is very Western into a indigenous population that doesn't really follow those tropes.
Do you want to just talk about what exactly this moral panic is for people?
Yeah. So what has happened is since 2016 in the southern United States, American Republicans have used trans rights or rollback of trans rights as a wedge issue to differentiate themselves with, American Republicans, and that's been highly successful for their political base, and that is translated to a lot of other conservative parties around the world, here in the UK as well. That has also been very, very particularly successful for them. That is now also translated into Pakistan, where they're saying that they're using the same language, saying that this is what these people who we don't like are doing to our society, and they're destroying society and so on and so forth. And they're using sort of the language of LGBTQ plus individuals, which doesn't really translate to how queerness has been conceptualized in South Asia. There might be, a select few who might sort of resonate with that, but not really, particularly in working classes. And so the idea of queer erasure is actually coming from the other direction, in terms of these narratives saying that queer people in Pakistan are doing what queer people in the UK, the US, for example, do, and saying that we don't like them because of what people who don't like them here are saying about them. Instead of actually looking at what's happening in Pakistan, what queer life is like, what individuals are like, what culture is like. Instead of investigating that and actually engaging with people on the ground, they're just sort of importing this narrative saying, you're like those people who we don't like.
But all of this also, like with Alex, this is also coming into your work as well, right? So and you've kind of brought this into the films that you have. So do you want to maybe touch base a bit about what's happening with there?
Yeah, so for me, I think the importance, coming from quite the opposite direction from what Alex is doing, where Alex is very much making very clear that this is, queer and trans work. I do allude to it, of course, because the context is important, but not so much. I don't sort of focus on the identitarian aspect of it. In the written works in the gallery, I use the word trans once because it's necessary for context in that. And apart from that, I'm not really talking about those things. I'm talking about resistance, I'm talking about displacement, I'm talking about sort of more universal themes like that, where discrimination can be a factor. and part of the reasons for that is I don't want this to be a trans thing, and we've had discussions about this.
Yeah. I think it's something that we do share in that when you're talking about transness, there's always this kind of, we're a mythical being that's existing outside of the rest of humanity, and it's that, no. We also do shopping, have bills, cry, go for walks. It's not that we're separated from humanity, it's just that it's an additional thing that we have to deal with. And I would say that my experiences as a woman who are trans do mean that I have slightly different experiences from other women. In the same way that I would say that my experiences as a woman who's disabled mean that my experiences are different from other women. It doesn't make me any less of a woman. It just means, there are other things going on in my life, as there will be for other women, and other trans men as well. Which, I think it's important to remember that so often when we're talking about transness, trans men get completely erased from the conversation.
I also just want to touch base here because you did mention disability within, and I think this is something we've also talked about intersectionality in both of your works, again, like the spectrum of experiences. And Layla, I know, for example, also in one of the acts of your 3 films, you're very much talking about kind of ADHD and kind of the way you're moving through the city, or kind of through Karachi specifically, when I say the city, and kind of like stillness and like the lag thereof, and how like ADHD kind of things like how that movement kind of like shifts because of your own kind of experiences. So it would also be, I think, great to like think a bit about intersectionality together as well, because that's something that you've both been also talking about the spectrum and the multitude of kind of holding spaces for all these identities.
So for me, I sort of approach it from the angle of taking away information and challenging the reader to sort of fill in the context, because when you're presenting an audience with a part of your life that has nothing to do with my transness, for example, they will read that context in, and they will be challenged in the sense that, okay, this is this mundane experience that is being presented by a trans person, and how does that factor in terms of their humanity? What is trans mundanity like? But at the same time, I have been diagnosed with ADHD, and for me, I challenge the idea that stillness lacks motion. So for me, a sense of calm is when I am fidgeting a little bit, because that's how I regulate, or whether I'm sort of enthralled by some sort of visual cue. That fans are a really big part of my work, because I find fans just absolutely fascinating. I could stare at them for hours. But that is also a form of regulation for me, and that is a form of stillness. And the way that I do it is by putting myself behind the camera instead of in front of the camera. So you don't see me, you don't see my face, you see what I'm looking at. And you're confronted with the sense of, oh, okay, this is what is being presented, point of view. What is happening for the person who is seeing this? And that dialogue between the viewer, who is also seeing the same thing, and with the knowledge that is what I had seen while I was filming it, is something I like to sort of use. And in that, all the intersectionalities come in. My ADHD, of course, comes in. My transness comes in. My being autistic comes in. Me being a person of color comes in. All of those things sort of come in.
And of course, the idea of person of color also shifts depending on if you're in Karachi or if you're here, of course.
Precisely. And I didn't want to be very prescriptive about that. So that is why I made sure that I was behind the camera, so that people would read in whatever context they could.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I had a similar kind of approach in that, generally speaking, some live art tends to be this is the canvas. So with this, especially at 83 minutes, you're going to get very bored of this face. So I made sure that all of the kind of characters and the costumes had face coverings, so partly so that you would deal with that problem, but also so hopefully it made it slightly easier for the viewers to kind of map their own experiences, and their own kind of bits that they can link into, whether they're trans or whether they're disabled or whether they're just coming in off the street and in no context. So that was going on, and then also as I was saying about the erasure of trans masks, we're both women who are trans, so it was very important to me that the film had some trans mask performers in it. So obviously we're not going to get the breadth of trans experience because that's impossible, but it was representing a little bit more than our experiences and our bodies. And also, again, me and JJ, who is one of the other performers, are both white, so it was important that there was a person of colour who's right for the performance. So there was at least a bit of balance and a bit of variety. And also it was, sorry, I'm muttering a bit, but
No, please.
it was really fun for me, and I always intended it, that the costumes and like the space costume that's at the end of the corridor were worn by different performers, so you saw the same character represented by different bodies, so it sort of inherently has that level of things shift and things change, and like the body that I had post having a physical accident was very different to the body that I had before, and there were changes inherent in that, but that doesn't make me unnatural or aside from the world. That's part of life, and that's not necessarily a negative. So I'm slightly touching on disability rights, but the fact that I do need a cane to walk around and I do wear down quickly it's affected how I interact with the world, and it's taught me patience. And like when you were saying about the stillness with the fans, there were lots of points where people would rush through things. It's a case of, I know that I can't make that train, so I know that I'm going to have to wait an hour in between trains, and I can get frustrated about that, or I can build that in and enjoy it and sort of people watch and think about things and have a much slower approach and build in things like recovery days.
I think this is also going into another thing that we've talked about. No, but this is great because you're starting to talk about collaboration and kind of bringing in other people into your work. And well, first of all, both of you are collaborating, and you've been collaborating for like at least 18 months in different ways, even though it was individual. And I first just want to ask, like, you met for the first time, like in person, in physical presence, like 10-ish days ago. So maybe, I don't know, just like how's that going? How was that? Like, how is it to make this space that is quite kind of bringing in two different, and I mean, if people haven't even seen the show, at least they've seen this kind of figure at the entrance and kind of something that's on the window. I don't actually know what the material exactly is.
Sort of holographic.
Holographic.
It just slightly changes.
And that changes literally depending on the light, so it looks quite different at like 5 p.m. and at like 3 p.m. and at like 10 a.m. and at midnight. But yeah, I guess, I mean, I want to talk more about collaboration and collectivity, and it's kind of important to both of your work, important to both of the way that you make the work. In New York, it was important to your residency process as well. So I guess first collaborating with each other, thinking together, and I guess I just want to kind of touch base about why is collaboration important, and how's it been and what's happening with it. Any of you can go first. It doesn't have to be, or talk to each other.
I think for me, it's a testament to how the residency and the curator sort of facilitated the space, as well as how Alex has been. That when I met Alex, I was not surprised by anything. Quite often when you meet someone after being in contact virtually for a very long time, you find something that is unusual or unexpected. But that did not happen at all, which I think was the testament to how authenticity was sort of built into our interactions, and our one-on-one interactions as well. So that's definitely how it has been in terms of my other collaborative work. So one of the things I like to do is I open up spaces for others to sort of jump in and do co-perform with me, co-create with me. And one of the things I did in the residency was I opened up the gallery walls for visitors to come and make interventions. So
and that will come in a bit, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The images, yeah, sorry.
I provided art materials, so paint, chalk, etc. And people were free to sort of make things on the wall as long as they didn't damage the wall itself. That was the one limitation I had. They could do whatever they felt like, and people. It was interesting seeing how the space evolved as the space became much more scarce. The interventions became much more aggressive, and much more sort of taking space from previous interventions and writing over things and blocking things out and so on and so forth. And the responses that I even had, I remember I once made a very panicky phone call to Aziz, and I was like, I don't know, this is too aggressive for me. I don't like these interventions. But I was reminded by Aziz how that too is a response that I had provided for people to make, and the fact that I don't like it didn't make it any less valid as a response.
This is the space at IVS is just coming up, and I think the whole space was covered with one side of the space was covered with writing that then we painted most of it over except one big wall, but it was quite an intense result at the end, I think. Yeah, over 3 months.
Over 3 months, yeah. I also,
you can see.
One of the things I also did was I provided props, so some of these are here as archives that we had in the show. And some of the props were broken, deliberately smashed, which is what prompted that sort of panicky phone call in which I was like, I wasn't expecting people to damage my things, but that itself was a response that I had to struggle with as a sort of co-creator in the space, where I provided materials and I provided instructions, but I wasn't actively creating most of the things in the space. So collaboration often comes with personal challenges in terms of desire, not desire in terms of how we want the space to be emotionally, whether we want it to be gentle or aggressive or so on and so forth. And you don't get what you want a lot of the times. So that's also very interesting to me.
You want to also jump in?
With collaboration, it was really nice being at residency here in Art Gallery Walsall, because we had I had 3 months downstairs, and it does link to collaboration. But I sort of set myself the task of every day I would make sure there's something new in the space, or I'd completely change the kind of sculptural thing that I was making, because having been the other side of the glass, it's like sometimes you see residencies and it's 3 months and it looks the same throughout, so it's like, every single time I leave it needs to be different. And just the collaboration with the audience that were walking past and seeing it every day and kind of how they were interacting was really, really useful in testing out things and working kind of what set people on edge and what they felt comfortable with and what they were sort of intrigued by and wanted to see more, and what they were disappointed wasn't there anymore. Especially with the front of house stuff, they go, I was hoping that'd still be up. Oh, okay. So I think just on that really basic collaboration with the audience, that kind of feeds in. And then during the filming process, which has been over the full year, I've sort of piggybacked on other projects. So when I've been off on other residencies and things, just carving out a tiny bit of time and taking a few little props to get a few extra shots. And then there's been this sort of collaboration between, if it's me and another performer, there's obviously that going on, and any random people that are walking past and then seeing a silver-suited figure in North Yorkshire moors. I mean, that's quite an experience. There was a helicopter going past that we were worried we were going to stop an a rescue, but they were fine. But then there is that collaboration with the landscape and with the environment, and I think it was kind of important to bed it into the land, so that it became very kind of, we're part of the ecology and even the geography.
That leads very directly into the next question, what you just ended with. But I just want to quickly also just say, so this is, again, IVS Gallery, and this was like Alex's presentation there, which was coming out of the residency here. So I guess a very first draft of this kind of film that you're showing, and then you can kind of see the elements of those kind of things that you kind of see in the space. The orange, we painted one of the walls, same orange. I don't think we got the same exact color, and the kind of entrance kind of fabulous curtainy kind of things as well. That again, we couldn't find the exact ones that you have here in Pakistan, but we found other kind of things. So it was nice to kind of think of that. But just kind of coming back to, I love the moment that you ended with the environment, but because the question that I was going to also ask is, and I know this is an overused word, especially since the pandemic, and also like in the art world, is like the idea of care. And it's kind of overused because I feel like a lot of the times people talk about it and then actually aren't like doing it. But also I feel like in this exhibition or in this project, we've been trying to think about care. And I think like some of this, like I do want to say in a very personal way, because we've talked about this, and I think this is important because a lot of the ways in which we circulate, I think from the global south in the art world, or get opportunities or show artists, is kind of through funding structures that come from the global north. So in this case, this project has been mostly funded by the British Council, but we've actually been kind of amazed at how like they've been also a bit relaxed with certain types of reporting requirements, which like I think took off certain pressures from us as well, because care is sometimes also, like if you think about capitalism, like it's very much about sort of very direct kind of, statistics and metrics and kind of things that you have to do, and that doesn't take into account things that we've talking about, like kind of sickness and illness and kind of what are people's actual needs, and kind of moving towards that. But I also love that you talked about the environment, because it also doesn't take into really account our relationship as humans with other worlds and other beings that we should be thinking about. So I guess, but in both of your work, you also embody care towards your collaborators. You're also worried about like what happens when these people are aggressive, but then that's also about showing care or lack thereof. Care is a reciprocal act. The work I feel like you did with the collections here is also really caring in a different way for potentially very problematic collections. And I know that project is ongoing because now the next conversation is about class and kind of race.
Conversation is
class,
yeah.
In the collection. So I guess just I'm putting care on a big kind of like trophy or a spectrum here, but multiple levels of care. But I guess it would be interesting to just like touch base upon that, and then I think from here we can also open it up after that to the audience and kind of. But we'll do that as soon as
I mean, I think because while we are dealing with sort of lots of topics and things, I think something that was very clean, especially once we were both here, was that it was a welcoming space and it was an open space and it wasn't sort of private and hidden off and just for small. It's that level of, no, Walsall Art Gallery it's for the public and it is open. So making sure that people could feel welcome and engage in the work in lots of different ways as well. So, maybe they are coming with a very kind of set level of experiences that's going to inform it, or maybe it's just raining outside and they need somewhere to sit down, and that kind of interaction I think is beautiful and brilliant, and that's a very light side of kind of the care end, but I think it's an important bit as well. But then making sure, I mean, your films are available on YouTube? Have I got that right?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So there's an access thing. One element of my film, the Mirror Ball section, has been online for best part of a year now. Some of the other sections will go on later, but at 83 minutes, it's probably not all going to go online anytime soon. But then I've been making sure that all the making has been on my Instagram and things, so people can kind of see behind the scenes and get an idea, and doing 3D scans of things. So even if you can't kind of make it physically, and hopefully there's enough bits that you can get a flavour of it, I think.
For me, whenever we talk about care, the question is care for whom? Because care is relative in many ways, particularly when you factor in power dynamics. The default in any space means that certain people's emotional comfort is given precedence over the emotional comfort of others, and quite often that is the people who are more privileged in society generally. So care has a direction, as far as I'm concerned, and I bring it into my work by trying to make the avenues of care more apparent. So in the written text that I have on the orange wall, I do talk about comfort, and I do talk specifically about the comfort of allies and my own comfort, and how they sort of have an uneasy relationship, because sometimes it, at least as far as the more privileged individuals are concerned, it does feel like a zero-sum game, where if I am provided care is taken away from them. Although the reality is much more complicated, and so that zero-sum mentality is something that I do sort of interrogate and ask people to reflect on. Where equality, for example, can feel like you are being oppressive towards people who are accustomed to privilege, and sort of making and asking those really difficult questions in the space itself. But at the same time, when I am asking those questions and frustration is being evoked in the space as a result of people being challenged and asked questions they're not familiar with or they're not used to interrogating. Also knowing that my presence in the space is a form of providing care to people who are frustrated with me, in response to my frustration with them, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit like I'm upset because I'm being discriminated against. When I pose that to someone else, they get frustrated with me because they don't like it, or it makes people uncomfortable. But then taking care of them as a result of that, saying, "Oh no, I'm being displaced, but it's not about you. You're okay. You're doing okay." Even when they're not, sometimes. So making that sort of that power dynamic much more obvious is something that I do sort of bring into my work. As far as care and community is concerned, when I'm doing my collaborative work, I do sort of center care quite a lot. And I know you and I have had a lot of discussions in terms of sort of curatorial practice as well, in terms of the role of care.
But also the limits. We've talked a lot about limits of care.
And the limits, yes.
That we can also bring in both. Yeah.
The fact of the matter is you can't create in a situation where you feel unsafe. If you're feeling unsafe, you can't really have a creative practice in that moment.
Yeah.
And we have to, I think as collaborators, as curators, have to really, really think about how we can create that element of psychological safety. We did a group performance, I believe it was October, November, sometime in the autumn, in which I was working with a bunch of young artists, and our rehearsals were 4 or 5 hours long because a lot of it was care. A lot of it was, I can see how this is emotionally impacting you. Let's sit with it and let's talk about it. Let me offer you my insights in terms of what I am receiving from you. And perhaps as a result of my insight, I can offer you some feedback, some element of it's okay if this is happening. And here's an area where you might be challenged, but it is an area potentially of emotional growth for you. And making those offerings, saying, okay, I see where you are, I sense your vulnerability. This is obviously where my therapeutic skills sort of become really important, where I can say, oh, okay, I can see your path of healing is in this direction. And that also, since you're an artist, that's something you could lean into as a form of healing. But I'm available as someone who can offer that support in case you sort of are feeling really, really strained and vulnerable and uncontained. So I can be that container as well. When we did our rehearsals, 90% of it was just sort of being there for each other, and the 10% is when sort of all the artistic practices came out.
Thank you so much.